A 65-year-old housewife's affair with Neighbours' teenage son takes a deadly turn, leaving a small town in shock. What really happened? Subscribe to find out and let us know where you're watching from. July 8th, 1985, Oak Ridge, Wisconsin. Neighbors noticed the lights were on at 65-year-old Helen Fisher's house far later than usual. Helen was the kind of woman who always had everything in order. She baked pies for her neighbors, kept a perfectly manicured lawn, and never missed Sunday church. But tonight her curtains were drawn tight and no one had seen her step outside all day. The only sign of life was the faint glow of her living room lamp. At 10:37 p.m., a piercing scream shattered the stillness of the night, sending chills through anyone within earshot. It came from Helen's house. Seconds later, the lights went out. A neighbor, Joe Campbell, a retired firefighter, hesitated before walking over to check on her. He knocked on the door. No answer. He called her name. Still nothing. The next morning, Helen's absence was the first thing people noticed. She wasn't at the diner for her usual coffee. Her mailbox overflowed with unopened letters, and her garden hose was still coiled neatly from the night before, unused. The quiet tension spread quickly, and by noon, the police were called to do a welfare check. When Officer Mark Redding knocked on Helen's door, there was no response. He peered through the windows, but couldn't see much beyond a few overturned chairs in the living room. Feeling uneasy, he forced the door open. What he found inside would shake the foundation of Oak Ridge. Helen Fisher's body lay at the foot of the stairs, her neck twisted unnaturally. Blood smeared the nearby wall, as though she had tried to steady herself in her final moments. Beside her, shattered glass and a toppled vase hinted at a struggle. The coroner later confirmed she had died around midnight. At first glance, it appeared to be a tragic accident. But as investigators began piecing things together, they realized this was no accident. It was murder. And the story that began to unfold was more twisted than anyone in the town could have imagined. Helen Fisher wasn't as ordinary as she seemed. Behind her polite demeanor and impeccable reputation, there was a secret that involved a 17-year-old boy from the neighborhood. His name was Andrew Walsh, and he had just graduated high school. Andrew had been a regular visitor to Helen's house over the past year. To most, it seemed innocent enough. His mother, a single parent working double shifts at the local hospital, often asked Helen to keep an eye on him. Helen, always eager to help, had happily taken him under her wing. She helped him with schoolwork, baked his favorite cookies, and even taught him how to garden. But beneath this mentorship, something inappropriate had begun. It wasn't obvious at first, not even to Andrew himself. Their conversations grew longer, their touches lingered a bit too much, and Helen's glances became less maternal and more suggestive. By the time Andrew turned 17, their relationship had crossed a line, one that neither of them could come back from. Neighbors occasionally saw Andrew leaving Helen's house late at night, but no one thought much of it. After all, Helen was like a grandmother figure to everyone in the neighborhood. Who would suspect her of anything untoward? But things weren't as harmless as they seemed. In the days leading up to Helen's death, those closest to Andrew noticed something strange. He had grown withdrawn, jumpy, and irritable. His best friend, Tim Larkin, mentioned that Andrew had been skipping their usual hangouts and ignoring calls. When pressed, Andrew muttered something about feeling trapped, but refused to elaborate. Meanwhile, Helen had started acting differently too. She seemed distracted, anxious even. At church, she was quieter than usual, barely engaging in her normal conversations. The change was subtle, but it was there. A storm was brewing, and no one in Oak Ridge saw it coming. On July 7th, 1985, the day before Helen's death, Andrew was seen arguing with Helen on her front porch. Witnesses overheard snippets of the heated exchange, Helen saying, "We can't keep this up," and Andrew shouting, "You promised me!" Their voices carried through the humid air before Helen quickly ushered him inside, slamming the door behind them. That night, Helen called a close friend, Marjorie Grant, and left a voicemail. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Marjorie, I've made a terrible mistake. I don't know what to do. I think it's all catching up to me." She hung up before saying anything more. What happened between then and 10:37 p.m., when Helen's scream pierced the night, remains unclear. But whatever it was, it ended with Helen Fisher dead at the bottom of her staircase and Andrew Walsh nowhere to be found. As the police combed through the house, they found something chilling. Hidden in Helen's bedroom closet was a shoebox filled with handwritten letters, love letters, from Andrew. The tone of the letters revealed an escalating obsession, alternating between devotion and desperation. One letter, dated 2 weeks earlier, read, "You're the only one who understands me. Don't push me away. I can't lose you, Helen. If I do, I don't know what I'm capable of." The investigation was only beginning, but already it was clear. This wasn't just a story of forbidden love. It was a story of obsession, betrayal, and a crime that would leave Oak Ridge scarred forever. July 9th, 1985, 8 a.m., Oak Ridge Police Department. The morning after Helen Fisher's body was discovered, the Oak Ridge Police Department was buzzing. Helen's death, initially labeled an accident, had quickly escalated into a full-scale investigation. Officer Mark Redding, the first responder, couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Her injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall, and the overturned furniture in the living room suggested a struggle. Detective Sarah Monroe, a seasoned investigator known for her no-nonsense approach, was assigned to the case. She arrived at the scene that morning, meticulously combing through every detail. The shoebox of letters found in Helen's closet was bagged as evidence, and as Monroe read through them, her suspicions grew. "These letters tell me one thing," she muttered to herself. "This wasn't just some random break-in or accident. This is personal." Monroe ordered her team to dust the entire house for fingerprints. They found smudges on the banister, fresh shoe prints near the back door, and a partial print on the shards of the broken vase. But the most damning evidence came when they swabbed under Helen's fingernails. The lab results would take a few days, but Monroe had a gut feeling it would lead them to someone who knew her well. July 9th, 1985, 1 p.m., Walsh residence Detective Monroe's first stop was Andrew Walsh's house. She had already pieced together that Andrew was more than just a helpful neighbor. The letters, coupled with the witnesses who saw them arguing the day before Helen's death, made him a person of interest. But when she knocked on the Walsh family's door, Andrew wasn't there. His mother, Diane Walsh, greeted Monroe with visible exhaustion. Diane worked long shifts at the hospital and had little time to keep tabs on her son. When Monroe asked about Andrew's whereabouts, Diane hesitated. "He's been acting strange lately," Diane admitted. "He didn't come home last night. I thought he was staying at a friend's house." Monroe's ears perked up. "Did he say anything about Helen Fisher? Did he ever mention her to you?" Diane looked uneasy. "Well, he used to spend time over there. She was always so kind to him, you know, like a mentor. But I hadn't noticed him visiting much recently. Why? Is Andrew in trouble?" Monroe didn't answer directly. "Do you have a recent photo of Andrew? And does he have access to a car?" Diane handed her a picture and nodded. "He uses my old Buick sometimes." Monroe took note. If Andrew was on the run, they needed to move fast. July 10th, 1985, 9 a.m., Oak Ridge Police Department. The results from the forensics lab came back sooner than expected. The DNA found under Helen's fingernails was a match for Andrew Walsh. This, combined with the letters and witness statements, gave the police enough to issue a warrant for Andrew's arrest. But there was one problem. No one had seen him since the night of Helen's death. Detective Monroe expanded the search. Roadblocks were set up on the highways leading out of Oak Ridge, and officers combed through nearby motels and bus stations. Monroe knew that time was critical. The longer Andrew stayed missing, the harder it would be to find him. Meanwhile, Monroe dug deeper into Andrew's background. She spoke with his teachers, friends, and anyone who might provide insight into his relationship with Helen. What she uncovered painted a troubling picture. Andrew had been a quiet, reserved teenager, but those who knew him well said he had changed drastically in the past year. His grades had slipped, and he had become more withdrawn. His best friend, Tim Larkin, reluctantly admitted that Andrew had confided in him about Helen. He said he was in love with her, Tim revealed, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. At first, I thought he was joking, but then he started saying how she made him feel alive, like no one else understood him. He talked about running away with her, starting a new life. It was weird. Monroe pressed further. Did he ever mention feeling angry or betrayed by her? Tim hesitated. Yeah. A few weeks ago, he said she was pulling away, acting like what they had wasn't real. He was really upset about it. He said she was using him. This was the motive Monroe had been looking for. Helen's attempt to distance herself from the relationship had likely triggered Andrew's anger, but motive wasn't enough. They needed him in custody. July 12th, 1985. 2 p.m., abandoned farmhouse outside Oak Ridge. The search for Andrew finally led police to an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. A farmer had reported seeing a Buick parked in the overgrown driveway, partially hidden by tall weeds. Detective Monroe and her team approached cautiously, weapons drawn, as they entered the creaking, dilapidated building. Inside, they found signs of someone recently staying there: a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a flashlight. But Andrew was nowhere to be found. However, what they did find made the hairs on Monroe's neck stand on end. Scattered across the floor were torn-up photographs of Helen Fisher. Some were from community events, others appeared to have been taken without her knowledge, as though Andrew had been stalking her. In one corner of the room, a notebook lay open. The pages were filled with frantic, angry writing, alternating between declarations of love for Helen and chilling threats. "You'll regret this, Helen. You can't leave me. I won't let you." The evidence was damning. Andrew wasn't just in love. He was obsessed. Monroe's fear deepened. If he was still on the run, there was no telling what he might do next. July 13th, 1985, 11 p.m., Oak Ridge Town Square. The town of Oak Ridge was restless. News of Helen's murder and Andrew's disappearance had spread, leaving everyone on edge. Small groups gathered in the diner and on front porches, sharing theories and wondering how a boy they had watched grow up could be capable of such violence. Meanwhile, Detective Monroe sat in her office, piecing together the timeline of events. She replayed the evidence in her mind: the letters, the argument, the DNA under Helen's fingernails, and now the disturbing notebook. It all pointed to one conclusion. Andrew Walsh had killed Helen Fisher in a fit of rage, but where was he now? Just as Monroe was about to call it a night, the phone on her desk rang. On the other end was an officer stationed at one of the roadblocks. "We've got him," the officer said. Andrew Walsh just drove into the checkpoint. July 13th, 1985, 11:45 p.m., Oak Ridge Highway. Checkpoint. Andrew Walsh sat behind the wheel of the old Buick, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His face was pale, his eyes darting between the officers surrounding the car. The roadblock had caught him off guard, and now there was no escape. Detective Sarah Monroe arrived at the scene moments later, her heart pounding. As she approached the vehicle, she could see the fear etched across Andrew's face. He was trembling, sweat dripping down his temples, looking less like a murderer and more like a terrified boy. Monroe raised her voice, steady but firm. Andrew Walsh, step out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them. For a moment he didn't move, his gaze flicking toward the open road behind him. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he opened the car door and stepped out, his hands shaking as he raised them above his head. The officers moved quickly, cuffing his hands behind his back. Monroe stepped closer, studying him. "You're not going to run anymore, are you, Andrew?" she asked, her voice low. He didn't respond, keeping his head down as they escorted him to the patrol car. But as they placed him in the back seat, he muttered under his breath, "I didn't mean to hurt her." July 14th, 1985, 8 a.m., Oak Ridge Police Department. Andrew Walsh was booked and placed in a holding cell, but Detective Monroe didn't waste any time. She knew that the key to building a strong case was a confession, and she believed Andrew was close to cracking. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a scared teenager who had made a catastrophic mistake. Monroe sat across from Andrew in the dimly lit interrogation room. His hands were cuffed to the table and his eyes were fixed on the floor. She slid a cup of water toward him, waiting for him to speak first. "Andrew," she began softly, "we found Helen's letters. We know about the relationship. We know things between you two had gotten complicated." His head snapped up, his face flushing with shame. "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "She cared about me. She understood me." Monroe leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "I believe that you cared about her too, but something went wrong, didn't it? Tell me what happened that night." For a long moment, Andrew sat in silence, his shoulders slumped. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. July 7th, 1985, the night of Helen's death. Andrew confessed that he had gone to Helen's house that evening, desperate to talk to her. She had been avoiding him for weeks, and he couldn't understand why. "She said it was wrong," he murmured, his voice cracking. "She said she couldn't do this anymore, that it had gone too far, but she promised me we'd be together." According to Andrew, their conversation quickly escalated into an argument. He begged her not to end things, but Helen was firm. She told him their relationship was a mistake and that she couldn't see him anymore. Andrew's desperation turned to anger. "She acted like I didn't matter," he said, his eyes filling with tears, "like I was just some stupid kid she could throw away." At some point during the argument, Helen tried to usher him out of the house, but Andrew refused to leave. He claimed she grabbed his arm, and in the heat of the moment he shoved her away. She stumbled, losing her balance at the top of the stairs. "She fell," Andrew said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for her to fall. I didn't mean for her to—" He trailed off, tears streaming down his face. Monroe listened carefully, noting every detail. But there was one thing that didn't add up. "Andrew, if it was an accident, why didn't you call for help? Why did you run?" His expression darkened, guilt and fear warring on his face. "I panicked. I thought no one would believe me. They'd think I did it on purpose." July 14th, 1985, 12 p.m., evidence room. While Monroe was questioning Andrew, her team was busy examining the evidence found at the abandoned farmhouse. Among the torn photographs and notebooks, they discovered something chilling. A handwritten list of dates and times, matching days when Helen had reported strange noises around her house. It became clear that Andrew's obsession with Helen had gone beyond their relationship. He had been watching her, following her movements, even when she tried to cut him off. The partial fingerprint found on the broken vase at the crime scene also matched Andrew's, further corroborating his presence during Helen's final moments. July 15th, 1985, 9 a.m., Oak Ridge District Court. With the evidence piling up, Andrew Walsh was formally charged with second-degree murder. His confession painted a picture of a young man whose obsession and heartbreak had spiraled into a deadly confrontation. The town of Oak Ridge was rocked by the news, struggling to reconcile the boy they had known with the crime he had committed. As Andrew was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting questions. But Andrew said nothing, his face a mask of regret. July 16, 1985, Oak Ridge County Courthouse. The case of Andrew Walsh versus the state of Wisconsin quickly became the talk of Oak Ridge. For a town unaccustomed to such high-profile crimes, the trial was more than just legal proceedings. It was a spectacle. Reporters flocked to the small courthouse, their cameras flashing as they captured every moment of the trial that promised to expose the tragic story behind Helen Fisher's death. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. On one side sat Helen Fisher's family and close friends, dressed in black, their faces etched with grief. On the other, Diane Walsh sat alone, her head bowed, visibly broken by the weight of her son's actions. Andrew Walsh sat between his defense attorneys, his face pale and expressionless. He had traded the comfortable clothes of his youth for a stiff suit that hung awkwardly on his thin frame. He looked much younger than his 17 years, but the evidence against him made it clear he wasn't a child in this case. He was a defendant, accused of murder. District Attorney Laura Green opened the trial with a powerful statement. Helen Fisher was a pillar of this community, she began, her voice steady but commanding. She was a kind, generous woman who made the mistake of trusting the wrong person, a person who let his obsession and anger turn into violence. Green laid out the evidence, the letters, the DNA found under Helen's fingernails, the witness testimonies about the argument on Helen's porch, and Andrew's own confession. She painted a damning picture of a teenager whose unrequited obsession led to rage and ultimately murder. The prosecution called their first witness Tim Larkin, Andrew's best friend. Tim's reluctance to testify was evident, but his words were clear. Andrew was obsessed with her, Tim admitted, his voice trembling. He couldn't stop talking about her, and when she started pulling away, he got scary, angry. I told him to let it go, but he wouldn't listen. Next, forensic experts took the stand, explaining how the evidence corroborated Andrew's presence at the scene. The fingerprints on the vase, one expert testified, match Andrew Walsh's. The DNA under Helen Fisher's fingernails is a conclusive match to the defendant. With each piece of evidence, the weight against Andrew grew heavier. Andrew's defense attorneys argued that Helen's death was a tragic accident, not murder. My client is a young man who made a terrible mistake, defense attorney Martin Shaw said during his opening statement, but he didn't intend to harm Helen Fisher. What happened that night was the result of an emotional confrontation, not premeditation. The defense leaned heavily on Andrew's youth and his remorse. They portrayed him as a vulnerable teenager who had been manipulated by an older woman into a relationship he couldn't fully comprehend. Helen Fisher was a respected member of this community, Shaw said, but she made choices that blurred the lines of morality. She engaged in a relationship with a minor, a relationship that ultimately spiraled out of control. To support their argument, the defense called Andrew to the stand. A risky move, but one they hoped would sway the jury. When Andrew took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He looked down at his hands, avoiding the gazes of the jurors and Helen's family. His voice cracked as he recounted his version of events. I never wanted to hurt her, he said, tears streaming down his face. I loved her. She said she loved me too, but then she started pulling away. She said it was wrong, but I didn't understand. She told me to leave that night, and I lost it. I shoved her and she fell. It was an accident. I swear it was an accident. The courtroom was still as Andrew's voice broke with emotion. Some jurors appeared moved by his tears, but others remained stoic, their faces unreadable. Under cross-examination, however, the prosecution was relentless. "You say you loved her, Andrew," Green said sharply, holding up one of the torn photographs found in the abandoned farmhouse. "Is this how you show love? By stalking her, taking pictures without her knowledge, and writing threats like, 'You'll regret this, Helen'?" Andrew stammered, struggling to respond. His earlier remorseful demeanor began to crumble under Green's probing questions. "You didn't call for help," Green continued. "You didn't stay to make sure she was okay. You ran. Because deep down, you knew what you had done, didn't you?" Andrew's voice was barely a whisper. "I was scared." The most heart-wrenching moment of the trial came when Helen Fisher's sister, Margaret Caldwell, took the stand. With tears streaming down her face, Margaret described the devastating impact of Helen's death on their family. "Helen was more than my sister. She was my best friend," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to die alone, afraid, at the hands of someone she trusted." Her words left the courtroom in stunned silence, driving home the gravity of the crime. As the trial entered its final days, the jury was left with a difficult decision. Was Andrew Walsh a grieving, impulsive teenager who made a terrible mistake? Or was he a manipulative and dangerous young man who let his obsession drive him to murder? The closing arguments summarized the tension of the trial. The prosecution urged the jury to remember Helen's life, the evidence, and the pattern of Andrew's behavior. "This wasn't just an accident," Green said firmly. "This was the result of anger, obsession, and a refusal to let go." The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for understanding. "Andrew Walsh is not a monster," Shaw said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He is a young man who made a tragic mistake in the heat of the moment. Don't let his entire life be defined by this one terrible night." As the jury retired to deliberate, the town of Oak Ridge held its breath. The outcome of the trial would determine not only Andrew's fate, but also how the community would move forward from the shadow of Helen Fisher's death. July 20th, 1985, Oak Ridge County Courthouse. The jury deliberated for 6 tense hours. The courtroom, once buzzing with whispers and speculation, now sat in complete silence as the forepersons stood to deliver the verdict. Everyone's eyes were fixed on her. Helen's grieving family, Andrew's mother, and the townspeople who had come to witness the conclusion of a case that had shaken their quiet community to its core. Andrew Walsh sat between his attorneys, his hands clenched into fists. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. Detective Sarah Monroe watched from the back of the courtroom, her own heart pounding. For weeks, she had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Now, it was out of her hands. The foreperson cleared her throat, her voice steady as she read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Andrew Walsh, guilty of second-degree murder." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before they fully registered. Helen's family broke down in tears, holding one another tightly. Diane Walsh buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Andrew's head dropped, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the verdict settled on him. Judge Edward Banks thanked the jury and announced that sentencing would take place the following week. He ordered Andrew to be taken back into custody immediately. As the courtroom emptied, the town's chatter resumed, voices hushed and tinged with a mix of relief, sadness, and disbelief. July 27th, 1985. Sentencing. A week later, the courtroom was full once again for Andrew Walsh's sentencing. This time, the mood was different, quieter, heavier. Judge Banks addressed the court with a solemn tone, acknowledging the tragic loss of Helen Fisher and the devastating consequences for all involved. "Andrew Walsh," he began, "you have been found guilty of second-degree murder. Your actions resulted in the death of a woman who cared for you and trusted you. While the court recognizes your age and lack of prior offenses, it cannot ignore the gravity of your crime. The judge sentenced Andrew to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. For Helen's family, it felt like too little time for a life taken so senselessly. For Andrew's mother, it felt like a lifetime. As Andrew was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he glanced briefly toward his mother. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, tears streaming down his face. Diane reached out to him but was stopped by the guards. It was the last time she would see her son outside of a prison. The trial and sentencing didn't bring the closure Oakridge had hoped for. Instead, it left behind scars that would take years to heal. The townspeople struggled to reconcile the charming teenager they thought they knew with the boy whose obsession had turned deadly. Helen Fisher's funeral was held on a warm summer afternoon at the town's small church. Nearly the entire town came to pay their respects, but the atmosphere was somber. Her sister Margaret spoke through tears, urging the community to remember Helen not for how she died, but for the kindness and love she brought into their lives. Meanwhile, Diane Walsh quietly sold her house and moved away from Oakridge, unable to face the whispers and sideways glances of her neighbours. She visited Andrew regularly in prison, though each visit left her more heartbroken than the last. Andrew, once a boy full of potential, now spent his days in a cold cell, replaying the night that had destroyed his life and Helen's. For Detective Sarah Monroe, the case left a lasting impression. She had solved many cases in her career, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about understanding the tangled web of emotions that had led to tragedy. Monroe carried Helen's photo in her wallet as a reminder of the fragility of trust and the dangers of unchecked emotions. Years later, when asked about the case, Monroe would say, "It wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was about two lives destroyed by choices that spiraled out of control. I don't think anyone truly won." 15 years later, parole hearing. August 7th, 2000, Wisconsin State Penitentiary. At age 32, Andrew Walsh sat before the parole board, a shadow of the teenager he had once been. He had spent nearly half his life behind bars and had taken part in counseling and education programs during his incarceration. He expressed remorse for his actions, his voice steady but filled with pain. "I think about Helen every day," he told the board. "What I did to her family, is something I'll never forgive myself for. I don't expect anyone else to either. I just want a chance to live differently, to make something of the time I have left." Helen's sister Margaret attended the hearing and delivered a powerful statement. "No matter how much time has passed, my family still feels the loss of Helen. Her life was stolen and the pain never goes away. I ask the board to consider that before making their decision." After deliberation, the board granted Andrew parole, citing his behavior and evident remorse. It was a decision met with mixed reactions: relief from Andrew's mother, outrage from Helen's family, and quiet reflection from the people of Oakridge. Andrew Walsh returned to society a changed man, working quietly in a small town far from Oakridge. He lived a solitary life, carrying the weight of his actions and dedicating his time to mentoring troubled youth in hopes of preventing others from making the same mistakes. In Oakridge, Helen Fisher's memory remained a beacon of kindness and generosity. A community center was named in her honor, serving as a safe space for at-risk youth, a legacy that turned tragedy into hope. The case, though closed, remained a cautionary tale about the dangers of blurred boundaries, unchecked emotions, and the ripple effects of choices that can never be undone. For Oakridge, the lesson was clear. No town, no matter how quiet or safe, is immune to darkness. August 8th, 2000, the quiet return. Andrew Walsh left the Wisconsin State Penitentiary the day after his parole was granted. No reporters, no welcoming committee, just the lonely sound of a gate clanging shut behind him. The world had changed in the 15 years he'd been incarcerated, but one thing remained constant: the burden he carried for the life he had taken. He settled in a small town 2 hours away from Oak Ridge, working odd jobs and living in a modest apartment. His parole conditions were strict, but he followed them without complaint. Andrew kept to himself, avoiding questions about his past. The people who worked alongside him only knew he was quiet, reliable, and preferred to be left alone. But in his solitude, the memories of Helen Fisher haunted him. Her laughter, her smile, her screams. They played on a loop in his mind, a punishment far worse than the bars of his cell. Back in Oak Ridge, the Helen Fisher Community Center stood as a testament to her generosity and impact on the town. Run by her sister Margaret, the center provided mentorship, counseling, and a safe space for the youth of Oak Ridge, a resource that had been sorely lacking when Helen was alive. Margaret poured her grief into helping others, ensuring that Helen's name was remembered for her kindness rather than the tragedy that ended her life. Every year on July 8th, the anniversary of Helen's death, the community held a candlelight vigil. Margaret would speak softly to the crowd, her words a mixture of sorrow and hope. Helen's life was taken by someone she trusted, she would say. But we can honor her by building trust in each other and protecting those who are vulnerable. The vigil grew larger each year as parents brought their children and teenagers found solace in knowing there was a place to turn for help. Helen's story became a lesson for the younger generation, a reminder that even in a world that seems safe, vigilance and respect for boundaries are crucial. Years passed, and Andrew Walsh remained a shadow in his new town. But one day, his life took an unexpected turn. While working as a janitor at a local high school, he overheard a group of students mocking a classmate for confiding in a teacher about inappropriate behavior. The boy being teased looked desperate, on the verge of tears. Something inside Andrew stirred, a flash of himself at 17, lost and manipulated, screaming for help in silence. That evening, Andrew approached the boy after school. "Listen," he said, his voice low but earnest. "I've been where you are, and I'll tell you something. It's brave to speak up. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Word spread about Andrew's quiet act of kindness. Slowly, he became an unofficial mentor for the students who didn't fit in, who felt lost or overwhelmed. He never shared his past with them, but his empathy and patience made a difference. It was the only way he knew how to make amends, one small act of good at a time. In the spring of 2005, Margaret Caldwell received an unexpected letter in the mail. The handwriting was shaky, but the return address was unmistakable: Andrew Walsh. Her first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity got the better of her. With trembling hands, she opened it. The letter was short, its words raw and unpolished. "Dear Margaret, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed to tell you how sorry I am. Not just for what I did to Helen, but for what I took from you, from your family, from everyone who loved her. There isn't a day I don't think about her. I try to honor her memory by helping others, though I know it will never erase what I've done. I'm writing this because I want you to know that Helen's kindness changed me, even in her final moments. I hope her legacy continues to bring light to others, as it has to me. Sincerely, Andrew Walsh." Margaret read the letter over and over, unsure of how to feel. Forgiveness was something she had wrestled with for years. Could she forgive the boy who had taken her sister's life, now grown into a man seeking redemption? After days of reflection, she decided to respond. Her letter was just as short. "Andrew, I will never forget what you did to my sister, but I believe in the power of change. And if you are truly honoring her memory, then perhaps something good can come from this tragedy. I will never forgive what you took from us, but I hope you can find peace through helping others. That is what Helen would have wanted. Margaret Caldwell." The exchange of letters marked an unspoken truce between Margaret and Andrew. She never contacted him again, but she found solace in the idea that even the darkest acts could spark a glimmer of light. In Oakridge, Helen's story became part of the town's fabric. Her name was spoken with reverence, her life a reminder of the power of kindness and the importance of boundaries. The community center thrived, saving countless lives and giving hope to those who needed it most. Andrew Walsh lived out the rest of his days in quiet atonement. Though he never returned to Oakridge, he carried Helen's memory with him, using it as a guide for the choices he made. For him, redemption was a journey without a destination, a path he would walk until the end of his life. Helen Fisher's death was a tragedy that rocked a small town, but her legacy transformed Oakridge into a community of resilience and compassion. Andrew Walsh's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of obsession and unchecked emotions. And though the scars of that fateful night in 1985 would never fully heal, they served as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance for light to break through.